Imagine an automated military outpost designed by an ancient empire that, upon losing its satellite connection to the centralized command grid, immediately executes an emergency defense protocol. It assumes it is surrounded by hostile forces, turns its threat sensors to maximum voltage, and begins burning its remaining fuel reserves to run a permanent, high-alert simulation of an imminent assault. Throughout modern society, popular culture consistently pathologizes loneliness as a sentimental emotional lack, a psychological flaw, or a superficial failure of social integration. But structural network neuroscience has exposed a far colder, thermodynamic reality. Loneliness is a radical, hardware-driven reallocation of your survival machinery. When the human nervous system detects prolonged, involuntary isolation from its tribal network, it does not experience a soft psychological sadness. It initiates an ancient subcortical emergency state. The brain computes social isolation as the ultimate existential vulnerability, an evolutionary death sentence where a lone primate is completely exposed to predators. Your brain systematically trades its capacity for executive focus, creative intelligence, and cellular peace to transform your entire mind into a hyper-vigilant, self-consuming threat filter. To dismantle the mechanics of this neuro-isolation trap, we must map the fundamental processing hub for primal survival telemetry, the Periaqueductal Gray, or PAG. Located within the midbrain tegmentum, the PAG acts as your nervous system's raw, subcortical panic button. It is tightly wired into your primitive flight, fight, or freeze machinery. In a healthy, socially integrated brain, continuous signals of tribal safety and physical presence float up through the spinothalamic tracts, sending powerful inhibitory commands that quieten the PAG. This is the neurobiology of belonging. Your community acts as a literal chemical shield that keeps your primitive midbrain calm. But when you are trapped in chronic isolation, this inhibitory shield vanishes. The PAG is released from all top-down control. It enters a state of permanent, autonomous hyperactivation, firing continuous electrical distress signals directly up to the thalamus and the limbic system, forcing your body to experience a low-grade sub-perceptual state of physical panic that hums beneath your consciousness every single second of the day. The chronic hyperactivation of the midbrain gateway forces a profound pathological reorganization within the cell clusters of the dorsal raphe nucleus, or DRN. The DRN is globally famous as the brain's primary factory for serotonin, but network neuroscience has revealed that it also contains a unique, highly specialized cluster of dopaminergic neurons that manage the absolute baseline of social motivation. When you are socially integrated, these DRN dopamine cells fire at a steady, balanced baseline. But under the influence of prolonged isolation, these neurons undergo a radical structural remodeling. They become hypersensitive and hyperreactive. This is the neurobiology of the isolation craving. The DRN shifts from a state of calm motivation to a state of desperate high-voltage chemical deficit, mirroring the exact neural architecture of a starving brain or a drug addiction. Every time you catch a glimpse of a human interaction or look through a digital interface, these hypersensitized cells fire a frantic, uncoordinated surge of dopamine, locking you into an agonizing state of subcortical hunger that your conscious mind cannot regulate. This subcortical hunger signal climbs directly into the primary sensing hub of your higher cortex, the anterior insular cortex. As we mapped in our study of trauma, the insula is the master landing pad for interoception, the internal compass that continuously reads the visceral telemetry of your heart, your gut, and your lungs. When the dorsal raphe nucleus and the periaqueductal gray flood the brain with isolation signals, the anterior insula processes this data through a specialized neural matrix called the social pain network. The brain does not possess a separate circuit for social rejection. It routes isolation through the exact same hardware it uses to process a severe physical injury, like a broken bone or a localized burn. The insula translates the abstract state of being alone into an immediate, visceral physical reality, forcing a tightening in your chest, a drop in your heart rate variability, and a chronic hollowness in your stomach, transforming the psychological state of loneliness into a tangible physical wound that bleeds internally across your entire physiology. The visceral pain signals generated by the insula are immediately picked up by the master alarm system of the subcortex, the extended amygdala. Anchored by the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, this system is responsible for calculating long-term ambient threat landscapes under normal social conditions. The physical presence of a trusted tribal network acts as an unyielding biological veto that keeps the amygdala's perimeter sensors at a low baseline. But in the grip of the isolation trap, the perimeter fence is completely rusted open. The extended amygdala enters a state of allostatic hyperreactivity. It stops looking for specific, immediate dangers and begins running a permanent, non-stop scan for hidden threats across your entire reality. The baseline threshold required to trigger an internal panic response drops to near zero. Your mind begins to compute completely neutral environmental cues, the tone of an email, the expression on a passing face, or a minor schedule change as highly hostile aggressive events, locking you into an unyielding state of social paranoia. This subcortical paranoia remains entirely unchecked because chronic isolation inflicts immediate, localized structural erosion on the brain's ultimate executive manager, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or VMPFC. Located behind your eyes, the VMPFC is the primary biological shield responsible for assessing social context and issuing down-regulating commands to silence your lower survival alarms. In a healthy brain, it is the voice of reason that says, "Calm down, you are completely safe." But the continuous high-dose exposure to the stress hormones generated by an uninhibited amygdala causes a physical retraction of the dendritic spines within the VMPFC. The executive pathways wither away. The prefrontal shield enters a severe state of hypoactivity, completely losing its structural grip on the lower motor and emotional circuits. The steering lines are dropped. The lower, primitive survival networks gain total autonomous control over your behavioral output, rendering your conscious mind completely powerless to rationalize away the ambient terror humming through your system. The loss of prefrontal veto power forces your autonomic nervous system into a destructive high-velocity configuration known as the sympathetic lock. Your body relies on an elegant seesaw between the parasympathetic branch, which promotes rest and cellular repair, and the sympathetic branch, which accelerates your systems for emergency fight-or-flight action. When the brain computes that it is a lone primate vulnerable to extinction, it slams the sympathetic accelerator to the floorboards. Your body is locked in a state of permanent mobilization. Your adrenal glands continuously secrete high baseline concentrations of norepinephrine and epinephrine into your bloodstream. Your blood vessels constrict. Your muscles maintain a chronic state of unprovoked tension, and your respiratory patterns become shallow and rapid. Your body is physically executing a war protocol while you are sitting completely still in a quiet room, rapidly burning through your structural resources because your autonomic brakes have been completely disassembled by the threat filter. This autonomic sympathetic lock launches a direct molecular assault on the primary stress axis of your body, triggering a profound epigenetic pivot within the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Under normal conditions, your stress hormones are tightly regulated by the negative feedback loop we mapped in our study of trauma. But chronic isolation alters the literal genetic expression of your stress networks. The constant subcortical alarm signals force your cells to execute a widespread downregulation of glucocorticoid receptors within the hippocampus. The master thermostat is broken. Simultaneously, the cells upregulate their sensitivity to corticotropin-releasing factor, or CRF. This genetic pivot means your body becomes hypersensitive to stress telemetry. minor daily tasks that should consume minimal cognitive energy instead trigger a massive runaway hormonal explosion, flooding your systemic bloodstream with a toxic, unregulated wave of cortisol that your desensitized receptors can no longer clear or control. The metabolic chaos of a runaway stress axis eventually spills over the blood-brain barrier, triggering a dangerous state of central neuroinflammation. Your brain's primary immune guards, the microglia, are highly sensitive to circulating stress hormones and pro-inflammatory cytokines floating in your bloodstream. When the body is kept in a sympathetic lock for months, the microglia interpret the systemic stress as a sign of widespread physical tissue trauma or infection. They toggle into an aggressive, hyperreactive phenotype. They stop executing the clean, disciplined data editing required for memory consolidation and begin releasing a continuous cloud of pro-inflammatory cytokines, such as interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, directly into your cognitive networks. This central neuroinflammation behaves like a hidden, localized fever burning through your gray matter, slowing down synaptic transmission speeds, disrupting neurotransmitter synthesis, and clouding your working memory in a thick state of clinical brain fog. If this central neuroinflammatory storm is allowed to burn through your cognitive networks for too long, the brain executes a tragic structural consolidation through cortical volume loss. Under the influence of chronic interleukin-6 exposure, the delicate dendritic connections within your prefrontal cortex and your primary social processing hubs, specifically the temporoparietal junction, experience severe, localized atrophy. The synapses quite literally wither away from lack of energy and chronic toxicity. Neuroimaging studies consistently show that individuals trapped in long-term involuntary isolation experience a measurable physical shrinkage in gray matter volume across the very regions responsible for emotional resilience, perspective-taking, and complex social execution. This is a devastating anatomical reality that explains the self-reinforcing trap of the isolation state. Your brain is physically dismantling the exact hardware required to successfully connect with other humans, leaving you with a structurally shrunken social brain that struggles to navigate the complexities of human relationships. The revelation of this deep molecular, genetic, and structural architecture completely obliterates the popular cultural myth surrounding self-improvement and social connectivity. We live in a society that continuously bombards isolated individuals with superficial advice, telling them to just put yourself out there, change your attitude, or attend more social events. But the rigid reality of structural neuroscience proves these demands are biologically absurd. You cannot use a motivational quote to regrow the lost gray matter volume inside a shrunken temporoparietal junction. You cannot use pure logic to command a hyperactivated periaqueductal gray to stop firing its subcortical panic signals, or force an uninsulated hypoactive prefrontal cortex to instantly regain its top-down veto power over a hyperreactive amygdala. Loneliness is a systemic, physical hardware re-engineering of your entire survival network. Expecting a person to simply think their way out of a sympathetic autonomic lock is a biological impossibility, because the very neural tools required to execute that rational control have been structurally compromised by the survival response. We have now mapped the complete, devastating anatomy of the first phase of the isolation trap, revealing loneliness not as an emotional preference, but as a total structural reorganization of your higher brain. The loop is absolute and unyielding. The failure of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex leaves the subcortex without its top-down regulatory shield, releasing the ancient periaqueductal gray to fire its midbrain panic sirens relentlessly. This chronic distress forces a radical dopaminergic shift inside the dorsal raphe nucleus, generating an agonizing state of subcortical hunger that is processed by the anterior insula as a direct physical wound. Simultaneously, the extended amygdala enters a state of allostatic hyperreactivity, locking the body into a sympathetic autonomic loop that triggers central neuroinflammation and physically shrinks your social grey matter. The tool has captured the user. Your brain has rewired its entire infrastructure to treat human connection not as a reward, but as a high-stakes threat scenario, locking you inside a biological cage where the walls of isolation become thicker with every single day of neglect. Now that we have witnessed the terrifying structural architecture of the Neuro-Isolation Trap, revealing how chronic loneliness physically downregulates your prefrontal shield, floods your cortex with midbrain panic signals, and triggers an aggressive neuroinflammatory storm that shrinks your social grey matter, we must prepare to descend into the immediate downstream consequence of this hardware collapse. In our next section, we will climb directly out of the isolation network and journey straight into the deep motivational engines of the midbrain, exploring the anatomy of apathy to witness the neurobiology of the motivation matrix, examining the exact cellular blocks that prevent a rewired, exhausted brain from translating its abstract thoughts into physical action. When the brain is trapped in a permanent state of subcortical hypervigilance, it executes a secondary, highly destructive hardware adjustment, the complete decoupling of its primary reward pathways. In a healthy, connected nervous system, the mesolimbic reward pathway functions as your internal engine of drive, curiosity, and forward momentum. When you anticipate a meaningful interaction, a burst of dopamine fires from the ventral tegmental area and lands in the nucleus accumbens shell, creating a crisp, motivating wave of anticipation. This signal is then interpreted by the orbitofrontal cortex to coordinate physical action. But chronic neuro-isolation forcefully tears down the lines of communication between these nodes. The accumbens shell becomes functionally decoupled from your executive cortex. This is the neurobiology of the reward vector collapse. Because the subcortex computes the external world as a hostile field of threat, it actively blocks the synthesis of anticipatory dopamine for any external goals, flatlining your daily motivation and rendering the idea of stepping out to engage with the world completely hollow and unappealing. The decoupling of the reward pathway causes an immediate, severe functional failure inside the master calculator of human effort, the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC. The ACC behaves like an internal economic analyst, continuously running a high-speed cost-benefit matrix behind your forehead. Every time your mind considers an action, whether it is making a social phone call, going to the gym, or finishing a professional project, the ACC weighs the predicted metabolic cost of the effort against the expected dopamine reward. Under normal conditions, a safe, socially integrated baseline ensures the calculator is highly optimistic, easily authorizing energy expenditure. But under the weight of central neuroinflammation and isolation telemetry, the ACC's calculation metrics become deeply corrupted. The effort-value matrix flips into a highly conservative state. The brain computes even the smallest social or physical task as an astronomically expensive energy risk with zero predictable reward payout, physically freezing your willpower and leaving you trapped on the couch, entirely unable to mobilize your motor systems. This internal willpower freeze is structurally cemented by a systematic downregulation of your brain's tonic dopamine baseline. Computational neuroscientists draw a sharp distinction between phasic dopamine, the sudden temporary spikes you get from an immediate reward or digital notification, and tonic dopamine, which is the steady, continuous background current of dopamine floating through your synapses every single minute. Tonic dopamine is the literal chemical pressure that determines your baseline vitality, your posture, your physical energy levels, and your cognitive optimism. When your isolation filters remain locked in an emergency configuration for months, the brain intentionally lowers this background current to its absolute floor. The system enters a low-energy conservation mode. This tonic dopamine flatline drains all flavor and color from your reality. You do not just lose interest in social connection, your entire world sinks into a flat, gray state of chronic anhedonia, where your brain lacks the baseline chemical pressure required to generate a sense of anticipation or joy for any human experience. The combination of a flatlining dopamine current and a broken effort calculator triggers the activation of a highly rigid subcortical neural program, the learned helplessness matrix. Centered within the communication loop between the dorsal raphe nucleus and the medial prefrontal cortex, this matrix is the brain's ultimate automated white flag protocol. When the nervous system is repeatedly subjected to a condition of distress that it cannot immediately escape or fix, it concludes that its personal agency is entirely useless. The prefrontal cortex completely surrenders its top-down control over the environment. The brain stops attempting to solve the problem. This is not a conscious, lazy choice. It is a profound structural adaptation designed to save the body from wasting precious metabolic energy on an unwinnable war. The mind hardwires this state of helplessness into a default operational setting, creating a deep psychological paralysis where you lose the capacity to even see opportunities for change or rescue, even when they are placed directly in front of your eyes. With your outward-facing cognitive networks paralyzed and frozen by learned helplessness, your brain's internal narrative engine, the default mode network or DMN, spins out of control into an autonomous loop of destructive rumination. In our past deep dives, we mapped the DMN as the hyper-expensive resting network that builds your biographical memories and your personal sense of self. When your frontoparietal attention networks are no longer actively engaged in complex external tasks, the brain's processing power is dumped entirely into the DMN. The engine runs hot. But because your DMN is tightly wired into a hyper-reactive, isolation-biased amygdala, its narrative generation becomes deeply toxic. The DMN stops building a healthy, balanced story of your life and begins running a continuous, non-stop diagnostic audit of why you are alone. It tracks every social failure, replays every rejection, and projects highly catastrophic simulations of future abandonment, locking you inside a non-stop internal monologue of self-criticism that physically distorts your identity at the cellular level. As the toxic inner monologue of the DMN intensifies, it launches a direct structural assault on the very networks designed to help you read and understand other human beings, the mirror neuron matrix. Spanning the premotor cortex and the inferior parietal lobule, this highly specialized neural network acts as your mind's internal simulator. When you look at another person's facial expression, body language, or micro-movements, your mirror neurons instantly mirror those exact electrical configurations inside your own brain, allowing you to intuitively feel what they are feeling in real time. This is the biological infrastructure of empathy and social literacy. But like any complex neural network, the mirror neuron matrix runs on a strict rule of experiential use dependence. When you are cut off from real-world, face-to-face human interaction, these simulation networks experience rapid synaptic decay. The wires rust from lack of use. The brain loses its high-resolution for reading social cues, causing you to become socially clumsy, awkward, and completely unable to read the subtle emotional subtext of a room. The structural decay of your mirror neurons triggers a catastrophic calibration failure within your brain's master predictive coding engines, completely corrupting your social prediction models. Your brain is a proactive device that never waits to experience reality passively. It continuously projects top-down mathematical predictions of what an interaction will feel like before it even happens. In a healthy, connected brain, these predictions are anchored in data-driven safety. But in an isolated brain whose mirror networks are rusted and whose amygdala is hypertrophied, the prediction engine generates highly distorted, threat-heavy models of human interaction. Before you even walk into a room or speak to a coworker, Your brain has already pre-calculated that you will be judged, rejected, or misunderstood. When the actual interaction occurs, your brain forcefully filters the real-world feedback through this distorted model, aggressively magnifying a single neutral glance into a definitive proof of hostility, ensuring that your social predictions become an inescapable, self-fulfilling prophecy of failure. This distorted prediction matrix drives the brain to execute its final, unyielding behavioral fortification, the absolute consolidation of the avoidance vector. In network neuroscience, your actions are constantly dictated by a structural seesaw between the approach vector, driven by the nucleus accumbens and dopamine, and the avoidance vector, managed by the habit-forming loops of the dorsal striatum and the fear circuits of the amygdala. When human interaction consistently registers across your prediction engines as an expensive, painful, and dangerous threat scenario, the brain quietly shifts its entire operational architecture over to the avoidance vector. The dorsal striatum takes over, transforming your isolation from a temporary state of circumstance into a highly rigid, hardwired habit loop. The brain begins to actively seek out isolation as a safe, low-resistance shelter. You start turning down social invitations, dodging phone calls, and actively running away from opportunities for connection, fully convinced that being alone is your choice, entirely unaware that your behavior is being dictated by a rewired survival machine running an automated defense script. The structural dominance of the avoidance and threat networks eventually spills into your sleep architecture, forcing a severe functional failure inside your primary sleep-gating hardware, the thalamic reticular nucleus, or TRN. As we uncovered in our study of the childhood epoch, the TRN acts as your brain's ultimate data editor, using its dense inhibitory networks to silence the external world so your mind can safely drop into deep restorative sleep. But the constant, low-grade sympathetic lock and the high concentrations of circulating cortisol generated by chronic isolation act as a direct metabolic disruptor within the TRN's GABAergic cells. The editor fails. The sleep gate is left wide open. The brain loses its physical capacity to decouple the conscious cortex from the raw sensory telemetry of the environment. You enter a state of fragmented hyper-vigilant sleep, where your mind remains locked in a semi-conscious guard posture throughout the night, completely destroying your deep sleep cycles and starving your brain of the vital neural repair windows required to clear out its central neuroinflammation. As your sleep architecture breaks down, your brain's primary network for intentional, strategic focus, the frontoparietal control network, or FPCN, enters a state of structural freeze. The FPCN relies on high-velocity white matter superhighways to send clear top-down instructions across the entire cortex, allowing you to suppress background static, manage your time, and execute complex professional goals with absolute clarity. But under the combined weight of chronic sleep deprivation, tonic dopamine depletion, and DMN rumination loops, the white matter cables of the FPCN experience a severe reduction in electrical velocity. The lines are filled with static. Your executive center loses its capacity to direct your attention or control your impulses. You find yourself completely unable to focus on a book, sustain a professional task, or manage your daily routine, entering a state of chronic, disorganized execution where your mind drifts helplessly between low-effort digital distractions, completely bankrupted by a system that is burning its entire fuel budget on maintaining its subcortical survival walls. This executive breakdown drives the isolated individual straight into the most dangerous trap of the modern consumer design landscape, the illusion of digital connection. When a rewired, dopamine-starved brain seeks out immediate relief from its subcortical hunger, it turns to social media feeds, online forums, and digital avatars. But network neuroscience has exposed a devastating, mechanical truth. Digital interfaces are computed by the human midbrain as an agonizing, uncoordinated prediction error. Your phone can display a human face and play a human voice, but it completely lacks the rich, multisensory telemetry required to quieten your primitive midbrain. It cannot offer real-world proximity, physical touch, structural mirror neuron syncing, or coordinated autonomic grounding. The brain is teased by the visual image of connection, but starved of the actual biological payload. This algorithmic echo leaves the dorsal raphe nucleus more hypersensitized and depleted than before, hyperinflating your internal craving loops while keeping your body trapped in its physical sympathetic lock. We have now mapped the complete 24-block structural matrix of the Neuro-Isolation Trap, revealing how chronic loneliness fundamentally dismantles the entire processing framework of the human mind. The loop is total, closed, and self-reinforcing. What began as a primitive survival response inside the Periaqueductal Gray and the dorsal raphe nucleus has successfully climbed through your entire biology, decoupling your reward pathways, corrupting your effort calculators, paralyzing your willpower through learned helplessness, and turning your default mode network into an autonomous loop of toxic self-criticism. Your mirror networks are left to rust from disuse, forcing your predictive coding engines to project broken social models that drive the hardwired avoidance loops of the dorsal striatum. Finally, your sleep gates break, your executive control networks enter a structural freeze, and the illusion of digital connection locks you into an inescapable algorithmic feedback loop that continuously burns through your cellular resources. This is not a state of mind. It is a total biological incarceration that requires a precise physical network intervention to systematically dismantle. To dismantle a biological prison of this magnitude, you must completely abandon the traditional unscientific myth of cognitive rationalization. We have spent time mapping a machine that systematically shuts down your rational prefrontal shield, rendering your conscious willpower entirely unintelligible to your deep subcortical hardware. You cannot use a positive thought to command a rewired hypersensitive dorsal raphe nucleus to stop its dopamine craving loops, nor can you use logic to force an immune system running an aggressive neuroinflammatory storm to suddenly drop its weapons. If you want to escape the neuro-isolation trap, you must stop trying to argue with your higher brain and start executing a precise protocol of somatic de-escalation. You must enter the system through the bottom-up pathways of your body, using your physical organs, your breathing rhythms, and your immediate sensory telemetry to forcefully send a direct signal of authentic safety straight to your ancient midbrain panic button, forcing the rusted gates of your survival machinery to finally unlock from the inside out. The first, non-negotiable objective of any real biological recovery is the immediate, physical down-regulation of your primary survival gateway, the Periaqueductal Gray. As long as the PAG is allowed to fire its subcortical panic signals unchecked, your body will remain locked in a sympathetic state, your effort calculators will remain frozen, and your DMN will continue to run its toxic rumination loops. To force the PAG back into an inhibitory posture, you must exploit the hardwired mechanics of the spinothalamic tracts. This requires the immediate, structured introduction of high-intensity proprioceptive and somatosensory inputs. Activities that demand absolute high-precision physical coordination, such as weight-bearing mechanical movement, targeted resistance training, or deep high-pressure somatic compression, compel your body to flood your ascending sensory pathways with a massive volume of clean positional data. This influx of physical telemetry acts like a literal electrical surge that overrides the panic circuits, forcing the PAG to drop its alarm and allowing your subcortex to experience its first genuine moment of homeostatic peace in months. Simultaneously, you must deploy a direct, high-speed intervention to shatter the sympathetic lock of your autonomic axis, utilizing the hardwired pathways of the ventral vagal complex. Your vagus nerve is the primary biological superhighway responsible for deploying the parasympathetic brakes across your internal organs. To forcefully trigger this brake system and override a runaway stress engine, you must manipulate the mechanical stretch receptors inside your lungs and your carotid sinus through a precise protocol of extended expiratory gating. By executing deep, cyclic hyperventilation followed by prolonged resisted exhalations, where your breath out is mathematically double the length of your breath in, you physically force your heart rate variability to widen. The vagus nerve instantly fires a massive wave of acetylcholine directly down to your sinoatrial node, slowing your heart, dropping your systemic blood pressure, and sending a definitive chemical command that silences your adrenal cortex, systematically dragging your nervous system out of its war posture and returning your vehicle to rest and repair mode. As your autonomic axis drops out of its sympathetic lock, the systemic reduction in circulating stress hormones opens a critical biological window to clear out your central neuroinflammation, to force your hyperreactive, aggressive microglia to drop their pro-inflammatory posture and return to their protective phenotype. You must systematically clean up the chemical environment of your cerebral tissue. This requires a ruthless, multi-week elimination of all external metabolic stressors. You must aggressively cut off all high glycemic refined sugars, trans fats, and chemical additives that trigger systemic gut-brain inflammatory signals through the vagus nerve. Simultaneously, you must flood your system with high-density omega-3 fatty acids, specifically EPA and DHA, alongside potent blood-brain barrier-crossing antioxidants like alpha-lipoic acid and curcumin. This intense biochemical purge acts like a cool fluid flushing through your cognitive networks, rapidly lowering the concentrations of interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, clearing the thick brain fog behind your forehead and restoring clean, lightning-fast synaptic transmission speeds to your higher cortex. The removal of central neuroinflammation allows your brain to restart its primary neural growth engine, the synthesis of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. As we established in our study of overconsumption, BDNF acts as the literal fertilizer for your gray matter, absolutely essential for dendritic branching, synaptic health, and the formation of new adaptive pathways. To forcefully upregulate BDNF production and repair your shrunken prefrontal shield, you must subject your system to controlled, high-intensity cardiorespiratory stress, specifically Zone 2, aerobic exercise, and high-intensity interval training. Running your body at a sustained elevated cardiovascular baseline for 30 minutes triggers a massive release of BDNF directly within your hippocampus and your prefrontal networks. This growth factor surge acts like fertilizer poured over a withered field, forcing your ventromedial prefrontal cortex to rapidly regrow its lost dendritic spines, rebuilding your top-down executive shield, and giving your rational mind the physical hardware it needs to resecure its veto power over your lower emotional survival alarms. With your prefrontal shield offline no longer and your BDNF production running hot, you must immediately begin the mechanical work of recalibrating your mirror neuron matrix. Because these simulation networks experienced severe synaptic decay through use-dependent atrophy, you cannot wait to feel confident before interacting with other humans. You must treat social exposure as a strict, progressive physical therapy protocol. You must forcefully place your body in real-world environments where you are exposed to high-resolution, face-to-face human telemetry. Start with low-stakes, non-threatening micro-interactions, exchanging casual greetings with a barista, maintaining deliberate 3-second eye contact with a cashier, or attending a structured, activity-based group environment where the social pressure is minimized. This targeted, real-world visual and auditory feedback acts like a high-speed data stream that rewires your mirror lobules, forcing your neurons to rapidly rebuild their simulation pathways and instantly sharpening your intuitive capacity and navigate the emotional subtext of a room. To permanently cement these social gains, you must deploy a ruthless protocol of striatal reconditioning to completely shatter the hardwired avoidance vector of your dorsal striatum. Because your brain has spent months building a low-resistance habit loop that treats isolation as a safe shelter, breaking this track requires an aggressive process known as behavioral activation. You must systematically deny your brain its automated templates of withdrawal. Every single time your prediction engine projects an anxious model of rejection and orders you to hide, you must execute an immediate conscious countermaneuver. You choose the approach vector. You make the phone call, you show up to the venue, you engage in the conversation, using pure executive control to force your motor systems into action. This conscious interruption completely shocks your predictive coding networks, forcing your brain to process genuine prediction errors of safety and connection, which rapidly rewires your dorsal striatum, shifting your internal balance of behavior away from fear and firmly back toward a healthy, proactive drive for human exploration. This behavioral reconditioning, combined with the reduction of your central neuroinflammation, allows the brain to finally regate its sleep architecture by repairing the GABAergic networks of the thalamic reticular nucleus. To stabilize the TRN's editing networks and restore your deep sleep cycles, you must implement a strict protocol of circadian entrainment and chemical isolation. You must aggressively eliminate all high-frequency blue light exposure from digital screens for 2 full hours before sleep, cutting off the artificial visual inputs that trick your hypothalamus into maintaining a daylight alertness state. Simultaneously, you must ensure your sleep environment is kept at a low, cool temperature and absolute darkness, while supplementing with magnesium L-threonate and apigenin to directly cross the blood-brain barrier and boost the inhibitory GABA currents inside your thalamic nodes. This precise intervention allows the TRN to successfully close the gates of consciousness every night, locking out the external world and dropping your mind into the deep, slow-wave sleep cycles required, your new pathways of safety, and complete the structural restoration of your gray matter. As your deep sleep architecture stabilizes, the frontoparietal control network experiences a powerful structural resurgence. Starved no longer of its primary fuel sources and cleared of the chaotic background noise of subcortical panic, your executive command center fully resecures its long-range white matter telephone lines across the hemispheres. The electrical conduction velocity along your axons jumps back to maximum adult speeds. This network resurgence restores your capacity for deep, sustained focus, pristine working memory, and long-term strategic time horizons. You find yourself able to easily direct your attention, organize your daily routine, and execute complex professional goals without being pulled down by low-effort digital distractions or chronic anxiety loops. Your internal CEO has officially taken back the wheel, utilizing a fully repaired high-velocity frontal infrastructure to run your daily life with calm, unyielding sovereignty. The structural restoration of your executive control pathways allows for the final profound reclamation of your internal narrative engine, the default mode network. With your frontoparietal networks running at peak efficiency, they can once again send powerful down-regulating commands to keep the DMN's narrative generation under strict executive control. The toxic, autonomous rumination loops flatline. The internal self-critic is completely silenced. Your DMN is cleanly re-anchored into a safe, calm, and stable interoceptive reading provided by a healthy, de-escalated insula. Your brain stops using its processing power to run diagnostic audits of why you are alone or projecting catastrophic simulations of future rejection. It returns to its true optimal evolutionary purpose, compiling your biographical memories into a cohesive, meaningful, and empowered timeline, allowing you to view your life story not through a lens of vulnerability and fear, but through a lens of profound self-knowledge, strength, and authentic personal confidence. Yeah. We have now mapped the complete roadmap of the Neuro-Isolation Trap and its physical restoration, exposing the ultimate fallacy of passive recovery. We live in a culture that continuously tells isolated individuals that time heals all wounds, or that they should simply wait until they feel better before changing their lives. But the rigid reality of structural neuroscience completely obliterates this passive myth. Time does not heal an hypermethylated stress axis, time does not shrink an hypertrophied amygdala, and time does not clean out a state of chronic central neuroinflammation. Recovery is not a passive consequence of calendar days. It is an active, aggressive, and highly calculated biological intervention. Your brain to magically return to a state of natural health without actively changing its internal chemistry, its autonomic settings, and its structural input parameters is an anatomical impossibility. You must stop waiting for a change in feeling and start executing a change in hardware, treating your nervous system as a precise data-driven engineering problem that requires a systematic protocol to solve. We have reached the absolute finish line of this complete, absolute deep dive into the anatomy of loneliness, mapping the full journey from cellular incarceration to structural transcendence. The rules of human biology are unyielding, but they are also beautifully plastic when targeted with data-driven precision. By systematically deploying a protocol of somatic de-escalation, resetting your autonomic axis through vagal expiratory gating, purging central neuroinflammation, and upregulating BDNF to rebuild your prefrontal shield, you successfully break the ironclad grip of the Neuro-Isolation Trap. You prune away the hypertrophied pathways of fear, recondition your dorsal striatum for approach motivation, and restore your default mode network to pure, empowered awareness. You have transformed your brain from a reactive, self-consuming threat filter back into an expansive, high-velocity instrument of human connection and strategic intelligence. The machine has been mastered. By understanding the deep, uncompromising neuroscience of this path, you have claimed the absolute biological keys to rewrite your code, unlock your potential, and claim complete sovereignty over the lifespan epochs that lie ahead. If you have sat through all of this absolute standalone deep dive into the architecture of isolation, you have built a level of biological literacy that separates you from 99% of the population. If you value this style of strict, data-driven neuroscience over superficial lifestyle advice, you have found your community. Subscribe to keep building your neurological literacy. This is Archive of Becoming, and I will see you in the next deep dive. I will see you in the next deep dive.